Hey guys, and welcome to the show. So in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at databases, interacting with databases specifically, because GameMaker can't do that. If you want to have a rich relational data saving, retrieving experience, you've either got to fork out some dinero for a package that can do that, or you have to do it yourself. Now, there are a lot of options on the internet. There's guidance on GameMaker Studio 2, PHP, MySQL, or at least this person's looking for one. If you go into databases itself, over here, there's a lot of old articles of people discussing, ways to do it. But most of them point to either one of these sorts of marketplace packages or, kind of creating this wrapper which will intercept the request, pass them to a database, and retrieve data, send it back to your GameMaker Studio game. Because as we know, GameMaker Studio can do those asynchronous HTTP RESTful calls, which is quite powerful stuff. We've already done a video tutorial on that. Well, we've actually done 2 tutorials on that in one series. Check out those videos; they will help you understand what we're doing here. So in this video, we're not going to be using PHP. We're actually going to be using Node.js. It's quite lightweight, and I think there's the possibility we can automate a few of the processes, run, our server when our game starts, or when we deploy it, perhaps even have that server running just so that we can communicate with this wrapper no matter where our app or our game is deployed. And then also we're going to be using SQL Lite3. So this tutorial is all about communicating with a database that is local to the app that the player is playing. So it's the database is on their machine. It's not somewhere online across the world on some sort of server. Now, for this tutorial, I've actually created an entire guide in MD doc form. If you'd like to read that guide while you're watching this, please head over to my Patreon where you can download that MD file. It's quite useful as you follow along. I've got little notes of what I'm doing, where I'm getting resources from, what the code looks like, so you can copy paste it, or also little informational sections on what specific parts of it actually do. In this part 1, we're not actually going to be touching GameMaker at all. We're going to be creating our Node.js server. We are going to be creating our database. We're going to be putting data in our database, getting data out, deleting data, things like that, just making sure our back end of this experience is working. And then in the second part, we're actually going to be creating our game. I think it's going to be a simple character select experience, maybe for some RPG adventure game. You get to put in your name, select your sprite, click new game, and then that'll save the data so that when you come back, it'll allow you to choose your character and continue from where you left off. And then having that database will create the rich experience that we'd need to then, expand into our game. And I'll also show you how to kind of query that database quite basically using the command line. Now, before we begin, if you find this topic extremely interesting, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Make sure you enable the bell notification so you can get more notifications about when new videos like this come out. There are going to be a couple in this series. I don't want you to miss something in between. It's quite important that we follow along in sequential order. Also, if you'd like to support this channel, there is a link in the description to get to my Patreon. I really do appreciate those monthly donations. Or if you're a crypto fanatic, there are a couple addresses in the description that you can send me some dog coins. That would be quite fun. So without further ado, let's jump into the code and create something fantastic. So to start things off here, I want us to go to nodejs.org. So we need to download the latest version of Node.js, or at least have Node installed. I have got, if I go to my terminal, I'm using Visual Studio Code as my IDE of choice. Node-v. You see I've got 14.15.4. That's actually a version that's recent enough. So if you're wondering what Node is, you can just go to About here. It tells us that it's an asynchronous event-driven JavaScript runtime. It's built to be scalable. It's very lightweight, which I like about it. Here's, for example, a little server that they're running. It says hello world, but you can create something as simple as a file, JavaScript file that just says console log hello world, and you can run that and it'll actually print hello world to the console. So I do recommend you read up all about the technologies, frameworks, runtimes that you're using to create solutions, but ultimately they're all tools. It comes down to them being tools to solve the problem, our problem being a wrapper to connect to our database. So you go to the home page, download 14.17.2 and install that. And it will ask you, you can go through the installer, maybe we can just see what it does here. Let's go run. Maybe I'll go ahead and do mine too. Hopefully it doesn't need to restart. Or if it does restart, then I'm gonna stop there and we can continue because the version I've got on this machine is good enough. Okay, so if we accept Node.js, Okay, so I'm not actually going to install this, but you can. Just be sure that add to path is selected. If you don't have that selected, you're not going to be able to use the node command in your terminal. All right, so once that's installed, you may actually have to restart your machine, but that's not too much of a problem. Then go to any folder on your machine where you actually want to create your project. So I've already opened this up in VS Code over here that we saw earlier. We can simply go ahead and say npm init. So npm stands for Node Package Manager, but basically when you install Node, you get access to all these commands which help you build things. So here's our project name. We're going to call it server version 1. We're just going to click enter for all these. Don't need anything specific. Yes, that's okay. It's going to create a package JSON. This basically just describes your project. And now if I actually go to that folder, I can create, actually let's do it here on the left. I can say new file server.js, and inside here we can type something as simple as console log hello world. We'll save that. And then in that same directory, will be all right over here, we can type in node server.js. And there we go, it prints hello world. So it runs this JavaScript file and it'll do whatever you tell it to do. So a lot of what I'm going to be showing you in this is actually also described in several tutorials themselves on the internet that I've been researching. For example, here's one, how to start a Node.js project. So I'm not really a Node.js developer, so I just had to do this research myself. So this one explains all about Npm Init, how it works, how you can speed that process up, but we're not focusing too much on that. Then the next one that we've consumed is the actual tutorials point, very good place to learn all kinds of cool stuff. They talk about the Node.js Restful Api, and this is all about your get, put, delete, post. It's got everything you need to kind of start your server and create your endpoints. So we're going to be doing that in our video today. And then I've paired that also with some reading on Express.js. So Express.js is a way of creating a RESTful API, or kind of managing the inner workings of that quite nicely in our Node.js application. So you can see here, this tutorial uses Express.js. So all these links are in the description. You can read more about how they work specifically. Just to see, they have, recently committed 2 days ago, so it's still actually going strong. So once we've got our RESTful API, it's not going to really do much because it's not connecting to a database. So that's when SQL Lite3 comes in. Now here on SQLite there's actually a whole Node.js tutorial on that, on how to connect to a SQLite DB through Node.js. So this is awfully convenient. Links also for this in the description, but we'll be running through it in our tutorial today. So do give those a read. There's a lot of cool detail here. I'm not going to be going into all the kinds of fun stuff we can do. This is a very basic kind of wrapper that we're putting together. So bear that in mind. If you want something that's more complex and complete, read all the documentation and you'll be able to do all kinds of really cool stuff. All right, so let's go back to our empty project. Just says hello world, as we've seen here. Hello world does run. To start this off, we're going to say const express equals require express. Now express isn't actually going to exist, so we need to first install it. Now when we're dealing with Node, we get npm, which is a really cool package manager. It allows us to import kind of little packages, little utilities, little things that we can use in our app, so we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. So if we use npm install express, okay, so that's gonna get the package from the Node package manager. It's going to create a folder called node module, so that's where it actually lists, and these are all of its dependencies. So you can see here that one package has a lot of other dependencies inside of it, other packages it requires. And also we have a package lock which describes all of our dependencies that we now have. Make sure that these files are never deleted. Next up, I actually want us to install SQLite3, just like that. This is going to give us access to some SQLite3 commands we can use via Node.js. In the same way, we're going to be using Express.js to manage the RESTful endpoints. Very good. Now, if we go into our package lock, we should see both SQLite over here, and we should see our Express over there. So as you add new packages to your Node project, they'll kind of show up in this package lock. Okay, so now let's actually create our app. We're going to say const app equals express over there, and we want our express app to use express.json. So every request coming in to this application is going to be in JSON forms, not XML. Just want to make sure that Express understands the kind of parsing it's going to be needing to do to convert that JSON into objects and all kinds of cool stuff. Next, let's create an instance of SQLite3. So here we're going to require SQLite3. Again, remember we installed that, or we installed the package. And that goes there. Let's give it some space. And now that we've got SQLite3, we can start talking about creating a connection to our database. So now the const here, DB name, what do we want to call it? I think I'm going to stick to something really simple, just GameDB. You could use multiple databases if you want. I mean, I don't know if you can cross-reference them, but if you wanted a database for like general settings, if you want a database to store actual game world stuff, you could do multiple, and then you could create various controllers which have different sets of endpoints that then handle different connections to different databases. I mean, the sky's the limit on how you want to do this. But for now, we're just going to keep things very simple. We have a single database, calling it GameDB, and now we're actually going to create a reference to that DB, or at least to the connection of that DB. We can use the SQLite3.database. There it is. I'll change that to a dot. And we need to pass in the DB name. And then we have a little function here that says, you know, if there's an error, oh, I actually want to change this to 2 spaces. 2 over there. Then we're going to say if error console.error err. I think it has a message property over there. So if the database is having difficulty, that's going to log it into that line 9. Otherwise, we can just say, you know, connected to the database. And then give the database name over here. I can use backticks actually. Let's use backticks, do some interpolation. And here we can say $reduce DB name, right? And we can even use single quotes there to say, you know, quote unquote, this is the database we connected to. Full stop. Now, a cool thing that's kind of happening under the hood here, which is really great for our game in particular, is we don't want to have to manage the creation of this database, you know, kind of before the game runs for the first time. You might think that's a little too yucky. So basically, actually what SQLite3 already does automatically in here, so long as you provide it with a database name that is accurate, the one that you want to connect to, if that database doesn't exist, it'll go and actually create it for you in the same folder that we're dealing with right here, which is absolutely fantastic. So you'll see here we don't have this GameDB, but when we run this for the first time, it'll pop up as if it was always there, which is going to be fantastic for the first time your game runs. Okay, so next up, let's actually create the server, because right now this isn't going to really do anything. We just have a lot of references to things we need for later on. So we're going to say const server equals app. So again, that's Express over there. Listen, we're going to tell it to listen for requests on port 8080. We're using some function notation over there. Now we're using const a lot. If any of you are in the JavaScript world, you might be thinking, what about let? What about var? Ultimately, the rule of thumb is if you're not going to be changing the property that you're dealing with, always use const. And if you try change a const, it'll explode for you. So for example, if you've designed something to not be changed and you create it as a const and then you change it, then you know something's off with your design, because it'll kind of explode and warn you. So always use const unless you're planning to change the variable, in which case use let, because that'll scope your variables properly. If you use var, the scoping expands and can get a little messy. But again, this isn't a JavaScript tutorial. This is just absorb what you need to know to create and manage your wrapper for your database. So our host, that's going to be server.address, and here this is .address, and similarly we can paste that. Don't forget your semicolons. This is port, is that port over there. And I'm just kind of spitting these out so I can console log. If ever you do become a JavaScript developer, trust me, console log will be your lifesaver. And then here we're just going to print out where we're kind of listening, and here I need host port. Now, we can actually run this to see what happens, especially I want to make sure that this database creates itself. And then after we've run that, I want to actually seed the database with some information. So for example, if you picture the scene, you've given someone your game, they're playing it for the first time, it's going to create the database, but the database is blank. We need to actually create the tables and the structure we need. So we can actually, bring in some external files and then tell SQLite within our Node app to execute those files to create our database. But for now, we're just actually going to put all the code we need inside the server.js file itself, including the creation of the tables we need for this tutorial. So let's first actually just go ahead and save, and we're going to run this to see that our database gets created, or maybe there'll be some problems. We say node server.js. Okay. Okay, so here, verbose, that needs to be an R. Save, try again. Check that out. So we're listening HTTP. Okay, so that is not 100% correct. I think I need to use double quotes. Let's try double quotes. Listening at HTTP. This is another string interpolation. Let's just use proper string interpolation. Why not? We have the power after all to do whatever we want. Why follow different rules? Create some standards. That's what I say. Okay, that's much better. Let's see what it says. Connected to database GameDB. That's very good. And you'll notice over here is GameDB. Now I can't open it. Well, I mean, not like this at least. But it has been created. Now we don't know if it's actually doing anything. I mean, there's nothing inside it, but at least we know it's running. So let's Control C that to stop. And now what I want us to do is actually run some SQL when our server starts. And what the SQL is going to do is going to create a table for us. So again, we're going to be creating something we're not going to change. So I'm using a const. I'm using backticks to give us multi-line support over here. And we're going to be typing in some SQL. If you are starting off on your development journey, I highly recommend you learn at least the basics of your structured query language or SQL. Trust me, your life is going to be so much easier if you know how to query databases on the most basic level. A lot of people kind of hate working in the back end if they are like a front end developer, but trust me, in my own personal experience, it opens up a lot of doors if you know how the different parts of the stack that you're working on work together, and if you can actually implement changes all the way through from the very bare bones basic database all the way to your fantastic front end with your styling in HTML and twirlies and stuff like that. So in here, we're going to be creating a table, and our very special keyword is if not exists. I'm not a SQLite developer, so hopefully I don't make any mistakes. But all these different flavors of SQL all kind of use the standard SQL under the hood. They do have their own little quirks which can trip us up, but again, if you read those articles that are in the description, it'll help you better understand kind of the core functionality of what we're trying to achieve here. And we're going to come up with a name. Let's call it player. Again, I think what we're going to be doing is a character select screen. You fire the game up, you choose your character, you select your name, and you say go, and then that's going to send it to this player table, and this player table needs an ID, which is an integer, and let's just say that that's not null. That's a primary key with auto increment. I always use uppercase for my reserved words in SQL, by the way, so that's why we've got that. So an identifier, player 1, player 2, player 3, it's an integer, 1, 2, 3, 4, can't ever be null. It's going to be our primary key of this table, and we're going to auto increment it so that every time we create a player, it's going to automatically, put the 1, 2, 3, 4 as our ID inside there. What are we going to need? Well, let's go with a name. We can do an nvar char 50 character limit. Also not null. You can't play our game if you don't have a name. Sprite in varchar, let's do 50 also. So when we select our character in the game, we're also going to choose a sprite. We're going to take that sprite name and send it to our database so that we can later load the same sprite if the user clicks, from a menu. We can say that this is what your sprite looked like, this is what your name was, do you want to continue from here? That's also not null. And what we mustn't forget is our semicolons. SQLite likes the semicolons. And now that's just our SQL. Like, this is just a statement. It's not going to do anything if we don't execute it. So remember when we created our instance to DB, you can see Visual Studio Code is saying it's declared but it's never used. It's right, we haven't actually used it. So to use it, we're going to say db run. We're going to pass it the SQL, which is SQL over there. The second param, if we go up here, is actually, oh dear, can I see what the second param? It is, there we go, params, which we don't have. It's just a blank array. Later on, when we're doing a post, for example, we will need to pass through the params, and I'll show you exactly how they get from here into your command. Then we have a callback function. We can use this notation over here, and that callback function is then just basically going to do the same as if error. We can just do that and we'll return at the end. Console error message. Okay, very cool stuff. So if we save that file and I'm going to delete the database. We're not connected, so it shouldn't be a problem. Let's delete. Okay, let's go and run the node server, see if there's any issues. No issues. You see that actually must have succeeded. If it didn't succeed, we'd have a console error pointed on our screen, and it's created our database again, but it doesn't. Like, how do we know something happened, right? How can we be 100% sure that something has happened? Well, we can't right now because we don't have any way of selecting from there. We haven't created the GET request just yet. So what we're going to do is actually we're going to jump a few steps ahead. What I want to do is, remember when we installed SQLite over here? Now, living in our node modules, there should be the DLL, or there should be some way. See, now this is the JavaScript version of SQLite, but it's kind of not useful to us outside of the application. But there is actually an executable that you can download to use to query it, your database via the command line. If we go back to our browser and we type in SQLite3, we go to download. So what we want from here is actually the precompiled binaries for Windows. Here's the SQLite tools Win32x86. If you download that file, inside it there will be a SQLite3.exe, which we can then use to actually run commands against a database. So I'm going to go and take this file and I'm going to copy it into our directory. Can I just go copy and let's go in here, just paste it in the root. Will it work? There it is. So now to query this database, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new terminal. We're going to say /SQLite3.exe. All right. Now we can type .help to see what the commands are, but we know exactly what we want to do. Here's a hint: .open file name to reopen on a persistent database. So we're going to say .open game.db. All right. So now we've got a connection to our database. It doesn't tell us that we do, but we do. Now, if we had to go select star from player, there's not going to be anything in there because we haven't actually inserted any data. So just to show you that this works, let's do an insert into player, and then we say it needs a name and it needs a sprite. One thing to note is casing doesn't really matter. And we say values. Let's say Bobby, and Bobby's going to have sprite SPR underscore player underscore 1. Okay, so just like that, we're going to insert into that player table name and sprites, and if I click enter, again, it doesn't tell us anything that's happened, but something has happened, because if we say select star from player, we now get a bit of information. There it says ID 1, Bobby, and SPR player 1. So there is some data living inside that database right now. So that confirms at this point in time that we have installed all the tools we need to run our server, our Node.js server using Express, connect to our SQLite 3 database, create the database, create a table, connect to that database, and just wait. In our next video, what we're going to be covering is actually creating the RESTful API endpoints, the get by ID, post and put. We're actually going to be interacting with those endpoints to get and retrieve data to and from our database. And then later on in the third part, we're going to be tying everything together within our GameMaker game with a character select screen. That'll then push data through our wrapper into our database, and we will have reached success. So that about wraps up this tutorial for now. Please stay tuned for the next video. Links to all the project files are in the description, as well as links to other tutorials that I used to source this information and build this solution. If you'd like to support my channel, please check out my Patreon. I really do appreciate the donations. Also, if you want to get rid of your Dogecoin, there is a Dogecoin address in the description that you can send a couple cents my way. That would be fantastic. So until next time, happy coding, and I'll see you then.